ago, somebody mentioned the topic of chivalry, and that they wanted to learn a little more about it, and I had a book, so here we are. It is sort of the idealized image of knighthood, and it became a common moral allegory in early Christian literature. So it's kind of really only seen in literature. It does define some of the things that people tried to strive for, but it doesn't seem like it's an accurate representation of how people actually acted. So the basic term started as mounted men-at-arms. Chivalry is derived from the French word chevalier, which is horse rider. So it started as just those people. Then it sort of changed over time and became like the, as it says later, the spirit or customs of medieval knighthood. By the time it sort of really was in its heyday, it was specific to knights and the nobility. So these are a bunch of definitions from dictionary.com. So I broke it out into 3 texts. These are some texts that sort of summarize chivalry. These are by no means the only texts that talk about it, and certainly not the earliest. For the most part, most of the texts that we have that talk about it specifically are fiction. They're stories like the Arthurian cycle that talk about like, oh, the chivalry of knights and like how to live chivalrously. In like the Lancelot, Dulac Chronicle, that sort of thing. So these 2 are written in French, and 1 was written in Catalan, which was a type of Spanish. Only 1 was written by an actual knight. Of course, 1 is anonymous, so we don't really know who wrote it, but it was unlikely that a knight wrote it because it's a poem. Not that knights weren't able to write poems, it was far less likely for 1 to have written it. So the first one is, I can't pronounce French, so I'm just going to say the English title, which is The Order of Chivalry. That one was the anonymous poem. It tells the story of a knight who gets captured by Saladin, and Saladin is like, oh, I've captured you, and now you owe me a lot of money for ransom. And the knight's like, well, I can't pay that. So he offers him, so the Saladin is like, yo, you gotta teach me what it takes to become a knight. So he goes through like how to be ordained as a knight and what all the symbolic stuff means. And we'll go through that next. The next one was Book of the Order of Chivalry. This was written by a philosopher who was a knight at some point, but he's not known for being a knight. So he either wasn't a very successful one, or it was a very short time in his career. He's mostly known as a philosopher, like a mathematician. He was also extremely religious, so he became kind of a priest in his later days. And he wrote this book on his thoughts of the ideal of what knights should be like. And the last one is the book that I have, which is the Book of Chivalry, written by the actual knight Geoffroy de Charny. He was one of the most famous knights in the end of the 100 Years' War. That's the one. So he's pretty famous. He also features as a character in one of our favorite books very early on, and then he dies, and then the main character has his dagger. That was actually why I started looking at this book, was because I read that book, The Ill-Made Knight, and saw references to this person that was a real person, and was like, hey, that's real cool. I want to know more about that real person. So I found an English translation of this. So those are the 3 texts that I took a look at, and we'll start with the poem. So all 3 of these texts talk about symbolism between things that knights do and what they mean in a greater sense. This one specifically talks about sort of the rites involved in being ordained. and the steps you have to go through to like get up that morning, I guess. So first of all, you have to be baptized, which just is described as the general meaning of baptisms, where you're washed free of sin, and whatever else that sort of comes with. Chivalry is very, very, very closely tied to religion. The Order of Chivalry is ultimately an order of Christianity. So a lot of this is like, oh, you have to pray to God, and like you have to be good and like do all these things in the honor of God and all that sort of thing. So in this poem, which the link is at the top, and I'll post this on our group chat, or not the group chat, but the group page. So in this poem, he goes through these steps to make Saladin a knight. So he baptizes him, and then he like makes him rest in a bed, in like all dressed in white, which is signifying of like the eternal rest that they believed they would get if they did service to God well. It's referred to as the bed of paradise. So knights, Raymond Lull, the author of the second book, often talks about that knightly life is all about being in a struggle. Struggle to be a better person, struggle against your enemies, struggle against the enemies of God, that sort of thing. And at the end, you would get to rest in the bed of paradise, where you could finally have peace. The white linen obviously signifies like being clean and rising pure. Then they put on a scarlet gown, which signifies the blood given in service. And then there's a contradiction in the next line where he says brown, and then the next line down, he's like, oh, these shoes are black. But I think black makes more sense because these signify the reminder that you're on a journey and the journey will end in death. But if you do it well, you will end in eternal rest, which is good, but it's also death. But it also means that they are simple, they're not decorated, they're just simple, sturdy, unadorned boots, because everybody walks the same road. Whether their paths go different ways, it's all the same road, so you shouldn't be prideful. Next, there is a white belt. This one kind of seemed like the same definition as what we had before, where being clean of soul and body, but there was an interesting allegory to it where it says the reins to hold his body free from stain, which I thought was kind of interesting because we think about belts and they like hold your pants up or hold your chainmail up a little bit. So it was kind of an interesting look at like, oh, this belt is holding me kind of together and free from staining myself. Then, of course, the spurs, which is a common knightly feature, which are gilt. This one had a kind of confusing saying to it, where he first is like, oh, yes, your spurs, because, of course, we know that the horse is super noble and you want to go fast like the horse. And then later he's like, oh, and it also means devotion to God. So I'm not really sure what the thing about the horse was. I was thinking it might be the speed with which you like do the works that you do, but I'm not quite sure on that one. Then of course you have your sword, which is to protect against the fiend. They talk about guarding the poor from the rich and the feeble from the strong. Pretty quintessential, like be good kind of feelings. And then you have a white coif, which is again about being clean, free from past wrongs, and so you can gain entrance to paradise. Finally, in the knight tradition, you slap the person, which sounds kind of weird to us, but it was signifying that the knight who is knighting is passing on the burden of like fighting to the new knight. It is defined as a slap most of the time, It then transitions later into the blow of the sword, which is just like you take the sword and you just lightly tap it on their shoulders, which is sort of the common one that we know today that we see in media all the time. But that began as like literally slapping the dude across the face. I assume it was light, but who knows? A lot of times it also included kissing them, which was very much a sign of honor and not weird to them, as it might be to us today, which is, who knows? So he goes through these steps in his poem, and he's like, all right, here's the things that I've done, that I'm doing, and here's what they mean. And then he gets to the end, and he's like, but there's 3 more things that you need to know in order to be a knight. And the first is, don't give women any reason to dislike you, is the way that they phrase it. And then the next one is fast on Fridays and go to mass every day. Those are the 3 main things to remember if you
one of the 3 is definitely viable.
So this sort of gives a general idea of a lot of the meanings behind chivalry and what they saw as like the ideal qualities in a knight. It's very full of religion, obviously, as I said. It's also interesting later on that these texts kind of have a, like, we know that people kind of don't really do this, but you should strive to do this anyway kind of feel to them, especially in the last text, and we'll get to that. But it kind of gives us the idea that they knew nobody else was really acting like this, but they thought they should be. So that's this anonymous poem that was written about a story about a knight being captured. At the end of the story, he is set free, so the King Saladin is like, hey, this was really good advice, and now I'm a knight, so we're good, and you can, my friends will pay your ransom, and it ends happily ever after. The next book was the book of the Order of Chivalry. Like I said, this was written by a philosopher. This was calling for reform, where at the time, a lot of the so-called knights were not really acting super chivalrously. I'm sure they followed some of it, but to someone that devoted their life to like study and religion and all that, they probably weren't following it as closely as they should have been. I believe this was also during a time of great reform in the society in general. This was written in the Kingdom of Majorca, which then became Spain later. So this one was not French. This one had some really interesting ideas in it, especially written by a philosopher. But being written by a philosopher, it also is slightly detached from what we think really was going on as a knight. Because he wasn't on the battlefield, he wasn't fighting, he was in like a monastery or like at his house or something writing this book. These were ideals that he was like, this is what you should do. But of course he wasn't doing it. This is where they talked about being a knight had to do with struggle. Where the virtues are the knight's weapons, and you use like truth and justice to fight against sin and whatever. It goes on further to talk about that, where it talks about like you struggle to better yourself, free yourself from vices. Obviously, you don't want to live gluttonously if you're a knight because you have to be fit in order to fight, that sort of thing. And it goes into the sort of stereotypical, like, protect those who are weak from the people who are strong kind of thing. And And then there was this interesting quote that I just found really fascinating to read. So, if justice and peace were opposites, in this we are thinking of justice as the just war, in which a wrong has been done to you and you wage war to revenge it. If justice and peace were opposites, then chivalry, which concords with justice, would be the opposite of peace. And if this is so, then those knights who are the enemies of peace and love war and its calamities are true knights,
Wow.
and those who pacify the people and avoid calamities are unjust and against chivalry. This seems like it is saying that he thinks that knights that are trying to, stop fighting are bad knights. Which is weird to us when we think the point of fighting and stuff is so that we can find peace, right? Obviously, not everybody thinks that way, which is why wars still happen, but theoretically, you wage war to, put down whoever your enemy is, and then eventually you go back to normal. At least that's the thought. He actually contradicts his statement later, where he says that knights try for peace, that the ultimate goal of knights is peace, which he also likens to the significance of a double-edged sword, where it's the opposite, but also the goal of chivalry, where you can have two opposing goals on the same weapon. I thought that was an interesting statement because most of the time when we think of chivalry, we think of sort of the general honor code, being a good person and being friendly to your fellow knights and taking a knight hostage instead of killing them. But here we see that there was also this part of knights should like war and knights should be good at war, which kind of really talks about how it's very much a military mindset. It has changed from this sort of view that we get of it up until today, where we don't see it as that anymore, but that's what it sort of presents as from these texts. The knight should practice riding, jousting, fencing for the training of his body, as well as virtues for that of his soul. So it's just a fun thing of actual advice. A lot of these texts is very oh, you should be good. And then it doesn't tell you anything about how to be good. It just sort of tells you the ideals, but then doesn't really talk about how they're in real actionable items. So the guy that translated this book, which is in the link, he mentions that the most important part of medieval books of a certain time period was at the center. I think Mike mentioned this a little bit in his first lecture, where he talked about symmetry was really important in religious texts and things, which would make sense with this. So the center section had the same number of pages before as it did after. So in this case, the center of this book is a list of the knight's arms and the meaning behind it. Surprise, surprise, more meanings. So this is not a picture from the text. I found this picture when I Googled it, but it is contemporary, and it pretty much portrays exactly what I imagine might be on this page. So, back into meanings. So the first and most important thing is the sword. The sword represents the main purpose of the knight, which is defending justice and fighting for a living. The lance is somehow akin to truth. I will also say that I got this list off of a summary of the passage. I couldn't access the passage itself, so this is just a very, very summarized version. So the lance is akin to truth. The helmet is akin to shame, to be obedient to the Order of Chivalry. So at some point it talks about how it's a bad thing to be subservient to certain things. So obviously these books talk a lot about like, oh, you have to be super loyal to your lord and to your king and anyone who's like above you in the social. But it also sort of has this undertone of like, you are your own master and you shouldn't be obedient to others, which I think is where this comes from, where it's like, oh, you're obedient to your order, but it is somehow shameful to be obedient, but also good. It's kind of a weird contradiction. But the helmet hides your face so that you cannot be seen or recognized. The hauberk signifies castle and a rampart against vices, so you're secure in your castle and none of the vices can get to you. This was an interesting word that I didn't know existed. I knew sabatons. Solorets are also sabatons, they're just armored shoes. But we talk about sabatons, I just never heard the term solorets, but that's there. Again, with the shoes, it has stuff to do with roads. So knights were sort of tasked with the safekeeping of roads. If they were on a road, they were sort of obligated to take care of any banditry that they saw or like protect the people on. And then, of course, you have your spurs, which represent diligence and honoring of the Order of Chivalry. The gorget represents obedience. I imagine similar to like a collar, which is kind of odd, but there it is. A mace represents bravery or courage. Mercy, which was an interesting addition to this list because it's not a physical thing. But a knight should have mercy because he has hope in God to combat the enemies that he cannot or won't for whatever reason. Obviously, they have a shield. There are two specific places where it talks about a knight needs to stand in between the king and people. So if the people are uprising, the knight stands between the people and the king. But if the king is doing bad things, the knight is there to protect the people too. So it kind of goes both ways. Of course, then it goes into the saddle, which is firmness and valor in battle. For knights that were pretty well armored, most saddles had like a I don't know exactly what it's called, but like a backrest to keep your seat in the saddle, which is sort of where the firmness comes from. And then, of course, the horse is the noblest of animals. So, of course, if you have a horse, you are noble in spirit. This section then goes on to talk about all of the like pieces of a horse's armor and what they need. I didn't include them here because that wasn't included in the summary that I had to. But it does talk a little bit about like the bridle and the barding and all of that. Medieval manuscripts really like to go into meaning of things, and they like lists. So there's that. So you might have heard me say an interesting statement that medieval manuscripts, the most important part was the center. So I did a little research, and I found the center page of each of the manuscripts. They are very similar. So the center page, or the center section, so the center page was usually like the next page in each of these sections, where it was some of the guards. But if you flip back one page, it's the beginning of the section where it talks about the guard. For the Getty, the Morgan, and the PD, it's just longsword guards. I believe the Morgan one is guards in armor, but I'm not sure on that. Anyway, those are all longsword, and then the Florius is our deviant child, who is the masters of dagger. But I thought it was very interesting to find three of them say, hey, this is real important. You got to know the guards and what they do. So that was a fun little side note that I found. Now we're on to the last book. So this book, I have a copy of the translation and the translation notes. So this was written by Geoffrey Charning, who was an actual knight. So we think this is sort of our closest look at the mind of a real knight. It is very idealistic, but it is also very flavored with the hints that nobody around him is like doing these things, and he's trying to get them to do these things. In the intro, the translator talks about like this book was written by a scribe, so Jaffar Desharnais probably could read and write. It's very likely during his time period that he could read, and it's probable that he could also write. But he wouldn't have sat down and written this whole book by himself. So he makes the comment of like, this book was probably dictated to a scribe, hence there's occasional like exclamations of like, ah, God, and the scribe like writes those down. So there's literally, ah, God, exclamation point, and then he moves on. So he was probably walking around and exclaiming things, and the translator makes the comment of like, this book is best understood given like a live telling of it with lots of hand gestures and probably a flagon of wine outside, which that was a fun comment. He also mentions that Desharnais is very much of the idea of why use one word when you can use three. His book is very, very wordy, and it's a lot of repetition. It's very like, it's chock full of sentences that just go on and on and on, and he says the same things. But it's a bit of a bear to read. But here's sort of what he covers. So the first section, he talks about the different types of men-at-arms as he sees them and how they can achieve worthiness and honor. So he has this sort of ranking system where he's like, all right, there's these kind of people and these kind of people and these kind of people, and they can earn honor in this way, but if you do an extra thing, you get more honor. And if you do this extra thing, you get even more honor. And he ends each of his sections with some sort of like, but nevertheless, I say, he who does more. And then it somewhere changes to he who does best is of more worth. I don't remember exactly where that change happened, but he says this repeatedly. So each of the sections he starts with like, oh, these are people who do, like, people who study the arms for fun. They go to festivals and light tournaments where they joust and they have fun, and they're great, they're cool. But he who does more is of more worth. All of his sections talk about how good these people are. And then there's like a but somewhere where he's like, but they're a little too greedy, or but they're not the best people, but they're awesome. Like, it's very much, he's trying to give a pep talk where he's like, you all are great, you're all awesome, except you should do better. Like, it's kind of a funny read when you look at it in that way. He mentions all of the different people being worthy of honor probably at least 3 times in each section. So he talks about the types and how they can achieve honor, and then he goes into a very lengthy discourse about how important it is for like the nobility to meet these ideals, which is kind of important. I mean, if your boss is a terrible person, it makes you not want to be a good person to them, or in general. If your boss is the like epitome of a good person, it makes you kind of want to emulate them a little bit. So he talks about this, and he sort of jibes at the French nobility, who at this time were really seen as like greedy and extravagant and spending too much and not really good at fighting because they keep losing. At this time, they have lost quite a few, and like revolution is kind of sort of happening, or not revolution, but reform is happening, and he's like, hey, I'm going to jump on this, try to get a reform of all these knights and get their acts together. And he goes into a lot of detail, like, oh, you shouldn't be wearing a lot of jewels because that's like extravagant, and you need to have moderation in all things and all that sort of stuff. Compared to the first section, which is like I think 12 small paragraphs, this is 6 pages, 6 whole pages, talking about this section. Then he talks about some more points on how men at arms should act. He has a whole section on like lady loves and like how to impress your lady and how ladies should be acting. The translator sort of thinks of this as a really important part of de Charny's book because he's very extravagant in his language here. But it is a product of its time, where it talks about like, oh, the proper lady must always strive to like have her knight be the best. So like, if you weren't a good lady, if you weren't expecting your knight to do more, if you weren't specifically sending him out to like do more stuff, if you weren't encouraging him, you're a bad lover, kind of thing. It's kind of a weird idea that he has here, and he actually talks about it later too. But his advice, his sort of feigned advice from the words of a lady is love loyally if you want to be loved. That's supposed to be if. Which talks about how like, he's like, oh, if you want to be in love, you got to be super loyal. Which is a very, I don't want to say it's a very Christian ideal, but it is like most sort of Christian teachings are like, oh, you can't having affairs and stuff like that. So that's basically what he's saying. He also talks about like, don't pamper your body. He talks about how like these soft bodies are no good on the battlefield, and like you won't be able to last very long going on like a march, and he talks about that a lot. He also has a section on don't fear discomfort, because you won't be a good man at arms if you can't like go on a march and like be fine. He digs at some more nobles where like, oh, you can't be good at this if you're afraid at like getting a rock, like that sort of thing. He also talks about a couple sections where he's like, oh, there are people that try to do good things, but they're also secretly bad. And he's still, even in these sections, he's like, oh, but they're good people. They're worthy of some praise, but they can always do better. And there's a couple different sections where he's like, oh, well, there's priests or like people who give a lot, who will like give in public, but then have a secret agenda of like getting renown from that or something. He's very optimistic about all of his topics. He talks a lot about God and how to serve God as a knight, and like you should pray a lot and go to mass all the time and that sort of thing. At the very end, he has a very interesting out of the blue seeming section where he talks about, where it's like a full section on, I believe it's the knighting ceremony, and then at the end, there's another section called How Ladies Should Dress. And it seems like it comes out of nowhere, but the end of the section before it was talking about how knights should dress. So then he talks about how ladies should dress, and it's quintessentially chauvinistic, but he's like, oh, ladies should take great care in their appearance because that's all they can do. They can't go out to war, so they can make themselves look real nice, and they can wear jewelry, and that's what they should be doing. But that's the ideas at the time. So, one of the things that he talks about that I also found pretty interesting was he really praises men in power. So he has utter belief in the like structure of kings, lords, the whole sort of command structure. He talks about how those men were chosen by God to like take the burdens that we won't take up. He's very optimistic about it in the sense that this is probably something he truly believed. He truly believed that the people in power were good, ultimately, people who were put there because they could handle the bad things that came of being in charge. Obviously, we know people are people, and that's not always the case. But he seemed to have this sort of like single-minded, the kings are like really good people and you should respect them because of all the things that they do for you kind of thing. He talks about it in several different sections, especially there's an entire section where honor men of rank, and he goes pretty deeply into that. Like I said, he's super wordy. It goes way further into things than he needs to, but he's also it's interesting because he's showing off that he has a very thoughtful mind, because this book, while it drones on, and you can tell that he sort of wanders around a little bit and starts a section and then says something he said before, it's also a very well like put together argument. He has different sections that are pretty clearly different sections, and all of this is just being said. Who knows, maybe he had like some notes or something, but it's likely that this was just dictated. So it shows that he was really quite intelligent for putting together this argument and organizing it in such a way through spoken word. And then I put out these are all of the types that he talks about. So this is the first section where he talks about all the types, how they can gain worth. At the start, it seems like it's ranked, where he's like, oh, this has some worth, this has more worth, this has more worth. But then towards the end, it's kind of like every same amount of worth, but the more of the things that you do, the better you are. So he starts with like the people who just go to festivals and do peacetime things, and they're athletic, and they do well in like fun stuff. Like they practice the art and they do it for fun, but they don't go to war and they don't do like competitive tournament kind of stuff. The next category is people that do tournaments for their reputation, and he says this is worthy of honor, requires physical hardship and sometimes death, and that's worthy. And then he talks about you get more honor if you go to like fight in a war. So you get a little bit of honor if you go to fight in a war where you don't have to go over. You get a little more honor if you go elsewhere. Oh no, sorry. You get a little more honor if you go to fight in that same war, but you didn't start as wealthy as the others. Like you're kind of poor. Because it is harder to do these things when you have less money, as we know from HEMA. Then he has this other category where he's like, oh, but these are really good fights in which you do all of the things mentioned above in the war. And he says an interesting comment where he says, for war requires jousting with the point of the lance and striking with the edge of the sword as in a tournament, and attacking with the sword thrust and other weapons as war demands. So here he divides attacking with the edge into tournament setting and attacking with the thrust into war setting, which I thought was very interesting because, as we know, I don't know who's clapping. But
yeah, I was going to say, I don't know who's clapping, but that was perfect.
It was Steve.
Yeah, I thought it was Steve.
It was Steve.
Yep.
But so he says the thrust is like the ultimate play and what you should do when you're actually fighting for your life, which I thought you guys would appreciate. Then he's like, all right, so you've been in your local war, now you go elsewhere. just to travel. This category is like, maybe you're not going for war, but you're a man-at-arms, going out to travel and see the world. And he talks about, like, hearing stories, but you shouldn't believe men unless you've seen these places for yourself. And, like, all the weird stories they tell of other animals and stuff like that. So he gives that a lot of honor. Then he says, oh, even better is if you're going on this journey for the purpose of work. I don't know why that's better, but apparently it's better. And then he talks about doing deeds of arms for reward. This is where it gets kind of interesting, because he goes into these things that we might see as not good, where it's like, oh, you're just doing this for reward. Oh, that's a little not as great. But he says it's still worthy of honor. Like, he's like, oh, you performed a great deed, but you wanted to be paid up front first. And that's cool. But also follow these knightly traditions. For the love of a lady, performing good deeds, but only for a lady, in which to, like, win their hand or whatever. That gets a lot of points. Then he goes into great spending, where you spend a ton of money to go great deeds, but not too much that you become broke. Because remember, one of the ideals is not leniency, not being excessive, because that's a sin, kind of. So he says, like, spending a lot of money to, like, get renown is a good thing. Like, hey, that's cool. Just go out and do great deeds, and you're good. And then he says that it's even better if you don't get any renown from that, which makes sense, right? The unsung hero type thing. And then this category is, again, kind of weird, where he's like, deeds performed by men-at-arms who are brave but greedy. And they loot before the battle is done, which in this section, he talks about, oh, that can be really bad. That can turn the battle against you. If some of your force is not disciplined enough and start to, like, go looting, you can be overwhelmed in the last hour. But then he ends by saying, oh, this is good. Keep doing what you're doing, but be a little better about it. It's very interesting to read this and see where he's like, oh, all of you are great and worthy of honor, but you can just do this little one thing and be a little better. So that's kind of that book, which I thought was kind of the most interesting to read, partially because I'd read it before, but there's that. And in conclusion, this picture has nothing to do with anything. I found it and thought it was funny, so there's that.
Right, the medieval texts of snail fighting.
Yeah, I saw this and I was like, oh, there's a knight riding a dragon, and I was like, wait a minute, the knight is the dragon? I'm confused. So just enjoy looking at that. The chivalry we see discussed in these texts is highly idealistic. While people tried to follow some of these codes, and indeed the rituals, such as the knighting ceremony, were followed, people were as they are now, residing mostly in the gray area between wrong. Descharnes' text especially shows that people are not exactly the way he describes, but that he wishes them to be. And that's what I have for you. And that we're excited. The last thing is I will tell you about the fun of researching this, and like this picture shows you, you can find some fun things. But I also found this other fun thing, and that's this picture.
Wow.
Yeah, hey, where are your guns?
The best part about this is if you go to this link, this article is incredible. And it talks about how they got a question from someone where they say, why, asks our slightly tongue-in-cheek correspondent, are these horses having a cuddle? And they go into it. The answer is they are not. They are fighting because the horses are so loyal to their knights that they are fighting each other because their knights are fighting each other. But I thought it was a very fun picture
fight each other,
to show you guys.
hind legs, right?
Those horses love each other, dude.
There's just
Yeah, so there's my presentation on chivalry. I will say I am not nearly an expert in any of this. This was mostly done by Googling things,
obviously.
and I have some of these texts open. So if you have specific questions, I can go into them. Does anybody have any questions?
I don't have anything in particular, but I just wanted to say that this was really fantastic, and thank you for putting it together.
Thanks.
You're going to post this to the Facebook group, right?
Yeah.
Because I'd be very interested in going over those sources. I'd be interested in reading over some of the source texts.
Yep. So the thing about the sources is that this Google does this really annoying thing where they will give you previews of these books, and then like this book is like $100, so I didn't really feel like buying that. And then some of the pages it will rescind them, and it will be like, oh, these pages are, which is why I couldn't access all of one of them, which is this one that I'm looking at. But there are like stuff out there that you can find. I was able to find scans of some of the originals. So these pictures are from various texts that were maybe not originals, but I believe the Book of Chivalry was an original. The poem was also an original. I don't think it was the first time it was printed. I think this was a later printing of it, obviously, because it couldn't have been printed for the first time. It was scribed. But I couldn't find the actual original, like, scribing of that one. This middle picture is from a later reproduction of this one. Another interesting thing I found about manuscripts is that a lot of manuscripts will have a bunch of different manuscripts in one book. And I have a bunch of links here that will bring you to the manuscripts. So this has like a bunch of different books, all in the same book. Our text does not start until like, I think this one is pretty late, actually. 338. So a lot of these manuscripts were sort of mishmash of a bunch of different things that somebody thought to put in one book for some reason. But they are scans of an original historic document.
Wow.
Trying to get it to go to the next one. But yeah, so this...
Yeah, the philosophy brain in me just is like, I gotta get these.
So I have links to what I could find, but it's not nearly everything that could be found. And I also have a link to that news article of that weird picture. But yeah, I have all these links, and I tried to also separate them onto the things associated with. This book is pretty cool. You can get it for quite cheap. It's like a little tiny book. But some of it is also available on Google. So, yeah, I will add this to our sort of library of things. And you can have all the links. Any questions? Stuff about sources?
So I noticed that most of the sources you're pulling from were like 1100 to 1300. Do you know if there's sources like deeper into the like Renaissance that talk about it, or was that kind of outside the scope of your discussion?
There's a lot of sources. These were the three that Wikipedia says best summarizes chivalry.
Oh, okay. Well, that makes sense.
That's why I picked them. It just so happened that one of them was the one I had, which was nice to find out. But these are the ones that sort of talk about chivalry as a whole, whereas there's a bunch of other texts that mention it, but it's not necessarily their main focus.
Okay.
There's a lot of like stories and fiction books that talk about it, and it actually is most prevalent in early romance, as you might guess, because it's an ideal. And of course, knights are also seen as ideals a lot, especially in like the Arthurian cycle. But yeah, I'm sure there's a slightly more contemporary example, but these were the ones that sort of had lists and summarized things.
Nice.
I think, sorry, what's up? Did someone say something?
Yeah, I was just gonna say how all the religious symbolism was new to me and very interesting, since knights kind of fit into the layperson hierarchy that was supposed to mirror the hierarchy of the church.
Yeah.
But I'd never seen it laid out so clearly, like what all the rites that they had to go through to become knights meant in a religious context. So that was really good for me to see. Thank you.
Yeah, that's why these were nice examples. There's a lot more in terms of like traditions that the knights did. I mean, the knighting ceremony is more or less like it takes the same shape, but it there's a lot of different aspects to it that sort of grow over time. Like I said, the like slap on the face eventually became the like doffing of the sword on their shoulders, because I guess at some point somebody was like, "Hey, slap kind of looks a little weird. Maybe don't do that." But yeah, who knows? But there's lots of
Walking, because they did that.
What
That
was
movie
that?
Outlaw King.
Oh yeah,
The movie. Yeah, they had that like king slap all of the knights he knights, and it's like, this is your last unwarranted slap.
yeah. That was part of the sort of meaning. That one, this first poem was the only text that mentioned that one. I think Descharnes mentions it at some point, but I didn't go into detail on that section. But in this poem, he gets to the end, and he's like, "Oh, there's one more thing that has to do to become a knight, but I won't do it because I'm your prisoner and I can't hit you." And the king is kind of confused because he's like, "Wait, why won't you do this thing? Make me a knight, come on!" And he's like, "No, I can't." Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, so this paragraph, he says, "The stroke, why have you not given it to me and told me what it means?" And he says, "'Tis the memory-stirring thing of him who has ordained the knight and duly with his gear him dight." But I'm not entirely sure what he means by that. But he won't do it because he's like, "Oh, I can't do any ugly deeds because I'm your prisoner." And he's like, "Oh, but that's fine because I'll tell you about the other three things you need to know," which is where he gets into the next three things. But yeah, that was an interesting comment, the memory-stirring thing, that I'm not really sure what it meant. But yeah. Lots and lots of symbolism, and lots of religion.
Yeah, that's kind of a hallmark of the 1200s in Europe.
Yeah.
I really like, can you go to the slide where it shows all of the items of the knight's kit? I think it's like one below what you're in. Yeah, that one. I think this is a really cool slide, going through, like, here's your standard kit, but also we need to attach some sort of obscure symbolism to every little piece of it because you must be part of the church.
Well, and it's very similar to what we see in the sword fighting, where we have like, the tiger means celerity, like all that stuff. It's
Right.
very similarly structured, which I thought was a interesting sort of throwback to your talk of the Segmulus.
Yeah, it does have a similar feel to it of like, here's an image and all of the kind of esoteric meanings behind everything.
I don't actually know where this image is from because I just Googled like knights 14th century and this came up. But I'm pretty sure whatever I found it in said that it was from 14th century text. So it is contemporary to the text that I was talking about.
Yeah.
It also talks about how like this shows I think it's one of the first instances of the Holy Trinity on the shield.
Okay.
Which I thought was kind of interesting, but I don't know too much about it.
Was that the Holy Trinity shield?
I think so.
I spotted that. I've seen that image before. It's a really cool shield emblem, and if I recall correctly, was somewhat like common in that day and age. But that I don't know.
This was also a section of a book that I couldn't read the actual section. This was the one that I asked Derek for access to.
Derek.
But it's fine. But the book that I found, which is this one, gave summaries of all the sections before it got into the section, which was nice, and all of those summaries for me to read. So like this is all just summaries of what's in them. This one is also told kind of like a story, where it's very like medieval setup where there's a knight who goes off on his own into the woods because he's like, oh, I've been a really good knight all life, and now I'm putting down my burden and going to live in solitude. And then a young squire happens to find him by following and he finds this knight. And the knight's like, oh, I gotta pass on chivalry because you don't know anything. And here's this book. So he passes on his book of chivalry to this squire, who then learns how to be a knight from these passages. So all of these sort of summation of this book are available, but the actual section is not. Which was really frustrating because I got to like way down here. I don't know where these are from either. I can't find the notation of where these, which frustrates me to no end. So here's the actual book, and it shows it in its original text, and then it's in Spanish, and then English, and then Old English. So it starts, and then there are some pages missing, and then almost all of the pages get like truncated. So like 54 to 226. I was like, screw you.
That's super frustrating.
Yeah, because I was like reading it and I was like, oh, this is super interesting. Hey, wait, why just... So, but it is available on the Brand Library website.
Well, I'm sure we'll gain access to that.
But
these are really cool images, though.
Woof.
They are, and I was trying to find them elsewhere. They have to be from an original manuscript of this book, but I cannot find it. I've looked, so like they have a bunch of references, and I tried to look for the ones that were like this manuscript, but the ones they reference, they say something about notes on the manuscript. So the main manuscript, this one is the link that I found on the, or it might not be, I can't remember. I found a link of one of these texts, and it had no pictures. I was like, God damn you. And it was kind of interesting searching through websites in other languages, but I did find some things.
So, Derek, you want to get the club a copy of this manuscript?
I've actually already given her what she.
I have, yeah. I'll see if
for the
I.
future. But in the past, I definitely failed.
No, that's fine. I'll see if I can like find some more interesting stuff in it. or if it has notation specifically of where these are from. The other frustrating thing, so the book I have is the Desharnais book. He has pictures, but he makes absolutely no reference. There is no like footnote. There's no like bibliography. There's nothing, and he like annotates everything else. And he says, "Oh, we studied these 2 manuscripts," and then there's just like a random picture, and I'm like, "Well, where did that come from?"
That's weird.
I don't know if it's an unrelated picture that he thought was cool. Like, I have no idea.
You gotta set that shit.
Yeah, it's in this book. I don't know if it's in this preview, but yeah. Yeah, Desharnais is super wordy. But, yeah. So, there's my talk on chivalry.
Awesome. Thanks again, Christina. That was really cool.
Yeah. I highly encourage you.
Let's go.
Thank you. I highly encourage you guys, if you have like a topic that you're interested in, go research it, because you will find cool, weird shit like this picture. But also, then come and present so that we can learn the things that you learned.
Yeah, totally.
These presentations don't necessarily have to be just from like the instructor. So, yeah, there you go.
Also, as a reminder, we haven't done this in a while, but if there's any other topics that people are interested in, whether they are directly related to like a specific technique from Fiore, or all the way out to like something like this, where it's just like, I want to learn more about chivalry or knights or whatever, feel free to let us know. Either drop it in here, leave us a comment down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe and smash that bell icon. But yeah, for real, let us know if there's anything that you all want to hear us talk about.